The vital Alaska Highway, a crucial artery connecting the remote state to the rest of North America, faced an unprecedented challenge in early June 2025. A raging wildfire, known as the Summit Lake Fire, forced Canadian authorities to close a significant section of this essential roadway. This closure occurred in British Columbia, specifically on Highway 97, west of Fort Nelson. The affected stretch ran between Steamboat and Toad River, severing a land link that thousands depend on. The Summit Lake wildfire was discovered in late May 2025. By June 2nd, the fire had exploded in size, consuming over 21 square kilometers of forest. The decision to close Highway 97 was not taken lightly. It was a necessary measure to protect public safety and allow emergency services to operate without hindrance. The closure meant trucks carrying essential supplies from groceries to medical equipment could no longer pass. Residents planning to drive south or tourists heading north found their plans abruptly halted. The economic ripple effects began almost instantly, as businesses contemplated shortages and individuals worried about the duration of the disruption. As of early June, British Columbia was battling approximately 70 active wildfires. For Alaskans looking south, the smoke-filled skies over British Columbia were not just an environmental concern, but a direct threat to their connectivity and economic stability. Beyond the immediate crisis of the wildfire, another storm was brewing on the U.S. Canada border, this one economic. In April 2025, British Columbia's Premier, David Eby, announced a controversial plan. He intended to introduce legislation that would impose tolls on commercial trucks. These tolls would target vehicles traveling from the lower 48 states to Alaska. Premier Eby stated this was a response to former U.S. President Donald Trump's tariff plans. The backdrop was a series of trade actions and threats from the United States. Trump had announced plans for a 25% tariff on all commerce from Canada and Mexico. While he recanted one announcement, the threat lingered. As of April 2025, the proposed tariff on Canadian goods was delayed, but uncertainty remained. British Columbia's proposed tolls were part of wider retaliatory measures. Premier Eby also directed the provincial government to halt the purchase of American products wherever feasible. Furthermore, he ordered provincially owned liquor stores to stop selling alcoholic beverages originating from Republican-led states, a list that notably included Alaska. The province aimed to pass legislation that would allow for rapid responses to any future executive orders from the U.S. that might negatively impact Canadian interests. This was a clear message. British Columbia was prepared to use its economic leverage to counter American protectionism. Ontario's Premier, Doug Ford, announced a significant 25% surcharge on electricity bound for the United States. Yukon Premier Ranj Pillai announced measures including stopping liquor store purchases from American companies and limiting American business access to government contracts. The combined impact of the Summit Lake wildfire closure and the proposed British Columbia tolls placed Alaska in an incredibly precarious position. The physical severing of the Alaska Highway by the wildfire immediately choked off a primary conduit for goods. Trucks carrying everything from fresh produce to construction materials and vital medical supplies were suddenly unable to complete their journeys, raising fears of shortages and price hikes across the vast state. The proposed tolls by British Columbia added another layer of economic anxiety. Even if the highway were to reopen, the prospect of new, significant fees for commercial transit threatened to inflate the cost of nearly everything imported into Alaska by road. Industry experts pointed out that high-value cargo, including critical components for Alaska's oil industry and perishable food items, often travels by truck due to speed and efficiency. These new costs would inevitably be passed down to Alaskan consumers and businesses, further straining an economy already grappling with unique logistical challenges and a high cost of living. Concerns were particularly acute for Alaska's food security. The news of Canada's actions, both the highway closure and the proposed economic countermeasures, elicited a strong and characteristically furious reaction from former U.S. President Donald Trump. Upon learning that the Alaska Highway, a critical link to the state, was physically cut off by the Summit Lake wildfire in British Columbia, Trump expressed deep frustration and concern. He viewed any impediment to American access and commerce with suspicion, even if the initial cause was a natural disaster. The proposed tolls by British Columbia, explicitly designed as a retaliation against his administration's tariff policies, drew even sharper condemnation from the former president. Trump had long advocated for an America First trade policy, which included imposing tariffs on goods from countries he believed were engaging in unfair practices, Canada included. The Canadian response, particularly from Premier David Eby, was seen by Trump and his supporters as an aggressive and unwarranted attack on American economic interests. Trump's erratic Canadian tariff plans had indeed created a climate of instability. His administration had previously announced, then partially retracted, then threatened again, significant tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods. This unpredictability had put Canadian leaders on edge, prompting them to develop defensive strategies. From the Canadian perspective, the actions taken by British Columbia and other provinces were seen as necessary responses to protect national and regional interests against aggressive U.S. trade policies. Premier David Eby of British Columbia justified the proposed tolls on Alaska-bound commercial trucks as a response to former President Trump's tariff threats. He argued that if the U.S. imposed financial penalties on Canadian goods, then Canada had a right to use its own strategic leverage. The highway to Alaska runs through BC territory, making it a point of control. The federal Canadian government under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau signaled its readiness to retaliate against U.S. tariffs. The overarching message was one of solidarity with provincial efforts and a commitment to defending Canadian industries and workers. There was a widespread sentiment in Canada that the country was being unfairly targeted by U.S. protectionism. The Canadian stance was one of reluctant but firm reciprocity. Regarding the Alaska highway closure, Canadian officials emphasized that this was purely a matter of public safety due to an out-of-control wildfire. The Summit Lake fire posed a genuine threat, and closing the highway was a standard emergency procedure to protect lives and allow firefighters to work. While the timing was unfortunate, compounding existing tensions, Canadian authorities stressed that the fire response was entirely separate from the political and trade disputes. They were committing resources to fight the blaze and working to reopen the highway as soon as it was safe to do so. The unfolding events in Canada sent waves of anxiety across Alaska, a state uniquely vulnerable due to its geographical isolation. Alaska Governor Mike Dunleavy expressed a cautious hope that the federal governments in Washington, D.C. and Ottawa would find a way to resolve the overarching tariff disputes. He emphasized the need for a swift resolution to avoid the cascading negative impacts on his state, which relies heavily on Canadian goodwill and infrastructure for its land-based supply chains. Alaska State Senator Robert Myers, representing a region directly impacted by the highway, voiced more specific and urgent concerns. He pointed to the potentially severe consequences for the supply of fresh produce and for the state's vital oil industry, both of which depend on reliable truck transportation. Myers acknowledged the technical ease with which British Columbia could implement tolls, given existing way stations, making the threat feel concrete. His comments underscored the tangible fear among Alaskans that their daily lives and livelihoods were being directly threatened by these distant political maneuvers and unfortunate natural events. The confluence of the Summit Lake wildfire and British Columbia's proposed tolls has cast a long shadow over the traditionally amicable relationship between the United States and Canada, particularly concerning the unique corridor to Alaska. This is more than just a temporary disruption. It's a complex crisis blending natural disaster with simmering trade disputes and sharp political reactions. The immediate challenge is reopening the highway, a task dependent on controlling a fierce wildfire. But the deeper issue is the economic tension, where retaliatory measures threaten to become entrenched, making everyday life harder and more expensive for Alaskans. The potential long-term impacts are significant. If British Columbia proceeds with the tolls, it could set a precedent for other jurisdictions to leverage geographical advantages in trade disputes. This could lead to a toll war or further retaliatory tariffs, escalating the economic conflict. For Alaska, consistently higher transportation costs would permeate every sector of its economy, potentially impacting its competitiveness, cost of living, and even population retention. Finding a resolution will require careful diplomacy and a willingness from all parties to de-escalate. The future of Alaska's lifeline through Canada hangs in the balance.